They said, "You need..." I stood by the sink, holding a dish towel that smelled faintly of lemon and bleach, and watched her rearrange her sentences like furniture in a room she no longer wanted to enter. I was 78 that year, and I had thought I was still useful. I cooked, I did the laundry, I picked up her children from school when her meetings ran late. I was slow, yes, but steady, yet somehow my steadiness had become a burden, a reminder of the body she might one day inherit. I suppose no one wants to see their own future sitting at the breakfast table, buttering toast. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Claire had mastered the art of gentle dismissal, of turning necessity into nuisance. It began with little corrections. "Don't wear that cardigan when we go out, Mom. It's too heavy for spring." "Please don't tell that story again. The kids have heard it." "You don't need to make soup," I ordered in. Each small edit carved away a corner of my life until I was reduced to an outline, a quiet shadow moving between her kitchen and the small room she called my space. I had once painted my own house sunflower yellow. Now I lived among gray walls and silence. She said she loved muted colors. I learned to whisper among them. The day she sold our house, she framed it as mercy. "It's too big for both of us," she said, glancing around as if the furniture were judging her. "We'll find something more manageable." I nodded, because that's what mothers do when daughters sound firm and frightened at once. She smiled, relieved, already dialing the realtor. Within weeks, the house that held my entire marriage was on the market, and strangers walked through it commenting on potential. I watched them the way one watches a surgeon cut into living flesh, hoping for precision, knowing there will be pain. When the papers were signed, she hugged me and said, "It'll be easier now." Easier, as if ease were the measure of love. The new place was neat, efficient, and airless. A single bedroom for her, a converted studio for me in the detached garage. She called it cozy. I called it a storage unit with a window. There was a small bathroom, a microwave, and a lamp that buzzed faintly when the light was on too long. "It's temporary," she promised, smiling too brightly, "until we figure out a better plan." I nodded again, because that's what keeps the peace. On the first night, I unpacked my suitcase and realized she hadn't given me a key to the main house. Perhaps she forgot. Perhaps not. It took only a few weeks for temporary to become the new forever. She stopped inviting me to dinner, said it was easier for me to rest after long days. She started leaving folded laundry on a plastic chair outside my door. Once I caught her whispering on the phone, saying she just couldn't handle it anymore. I knew who it was. I had become an inconvenience measured in size. I tried to be smaller. I tiptoed, swallowed my words, smiled when she introduced me to visitors as my mom. She's staying with us for a while. For a while. Like a tenant who might leave once the lease of affection expired. Then came the morning when I found the envelope on the counter. My name written neatly, her handwriting trembling only slightly. Inside, a printed brochure for a senior community half an hour away. Sunrise Haven, independent living with dignity. The phrase made me laugh out loud, a short, dry sound that startled even me. Independent yet supervised, dignified yet cataloged. Under the brochure, a short note. "Mom, I can't keep doing this. You'll be better off there." No signature, just the shape of her exhaustion lingering in the ink. I sat at the table for a long time, tracing the outline of the cup she'd left behind, still warm. Outside, the wind carried the scent of cut grass and distant traffic. Everything ordinary continued, unbothered by the collapse of something sacred. I packed slowly that afternoon, folding clothes that still held the scent of my old life, lavender, starch, thyme. She didn't come out to help. She didn't even open the door when I rolled my suitcase down the driveway. I could have knocked, could have demanded a goodbye. But pride can be a strange comfort when love turns conditional. At the bus stop, I sat among strangers and counted the coins in my purse. It was enough for the fare and maybe a sandwich. The brochure was still in my pocket, its glossy smiles staring up at me. I tore it in half, then quarters, until it fit neatly into the trash can beside me. When the bus arrived, I chose the back seat and watched the neighborhood drift away, houses with trimmed hedges, mailboxes gleaming with new paint, lives curated and controlled. I had once planted roses in front of our old porch. I wondered if the new owners had cut them down. People like order, not reminders of what was there before. The motion of the bus was steady, almost soothing. The world outside was still full of places that didn't know my name, which meant there was still a chance to exist without apology. I arrived in a small coastal town by evening. The sky smelled of salt and metal. I found a modest room above a bakery, its rent low, its walls thin. The landlord, a woman with tired eyes, handed me the keys without questions. "Quiet hours after 9, she said. I nodded. That night, I lay on the narrow bed, listening to the hum of the refrigerator below, the clatter of trays, the occasional murmur of laughter. I should have cried, I suppose, but tears require hope that someone might notice them. Instead, I breathed in the scent of baked bread and sea air, and for the first time in months, felt something close to relief. Not happiness, not yet, but a faint loosening in the chest, as if the cage had widened just enough for air to slip through. In the quiet, I replayed her words. "You'll be better off." Perhaps she even believed it. Perhaps she thought safety was something you could outsource, that comfort could be bought by removing discomfort from sight. I don't know. What I do know is that love disguised as practicality can wound deeper than open cruelty. It erases you politely. It buries you in reasonable tones and organized schedules until you no longer appear in the photographs. I had been disappearing for years. She simply completed the task. Lying there, I made a small promise to myself, not of revenge or reconciliation, but of presence. I would wake up the next morning and make coffee. I would walk by the water and remind myself that the world still existed beyond her approval. I would start writing letters again, not to her, but to the parts of me I had abandoned. Maybe I would send one to Lily and Max, though I wasn't sure if she'd allow them to read it. But the thought of them, of their laughter echoing down the hallway of that cold gray house, was enough to keep me awake until dawn. That night, as the tide receded and the bakery below went silent, I whispered into the dark. They said I was too much work for one house. Maybe they were right. Maybe I am too much for any place that mistakes love for efficiency. And somehow, saying it aloud didn't break me. It built the faintest bridge toward the woman I used to be. The one who planted roses, painted walls yellow, and believed in a kind of care that didn't need to be convenient. The defining blow didn't arrive as drama. It came in the plain envelope of bureaucracy, sealed with courtesy. 2 weeks after I settled into the room above the bakery, a letter arrived from my daughter. The handwriting was clinical, measured, as if she feared her own emotion might leak through the ink. "Mom," it began, "I've contacted Sunrise Haven about a vacancy for you. They're expecting your call. I'll cover the first month until your pension transfer goes through. It's safer there, and I really can't manage things from this distance." No greeting, no tenderness, just the sterile rhythm of logistics. I sat at the small wooden table by the window, the scent of yeast rising from below, and stared at the letter until the words lost meaning. I had thought she had already finished the act of leaving. I hadn't realized she was still perfecting it. This wasn't abandonment by impulse. It was abandonment designed, notarized, justified. I could almost hear her rehearsing the explanation for others. It's best for Mom, really. She needs supervision. Supervision. As though I were a wayward child in need of correction. The bakery owner, Mrs. Green, must have seen the letter trembling in my hands when she came up later with a plate of leftover rolls. She didn't ask, just said, "You can stay as long as you pay rent on time," and left it at that. It was mercy, the kind that expects nothing back. I clutched the bread and thought of all the times I'd baked for Claire as a girl, how she used to stand on a stool beside me, flour on her chin, proud of the smallest loaf. Love can curdle quietly over decades until what remains is obligation, masquerading as concern. That evening, I took the bus to see the facility. I needed to know what she was consigning me to. Sunrise Haven sat at the edge of town, a manicured complex with hedges clipped to geometric precision. The air smelled of antiseptic and lavender, the perfume of sanitized sorrow. A young woman at the reception desk smiled with professional warmth. "Are you here to tour, Mrs.?" I didn't answer right away. My name, once spoken with love in my daughter's voice, suddenly felt like something borrowed. I nodded and let her lead me down a corridor where each door bore a cheerful name: Willow, Maple, Juniper, as though renaming suffering could sweeten it. Inside one of the rooms, a woman with cloud-white hair sat by the window staring at nothing. A television played quietly on the wall, the sound muted. The guide spoke about community events, safety protocols, medical assistance. Her words floated around me like sterile air. I looked at the woman again and thought, she's already practicing being forgotten. After the tour, I thanked the girl, stepped outside, and stood in the parking lot for a long time, watching the sun drop behind the perfectly painted sign. I realized then that safety was not my dream. It was Claire's. Safety meant control, containment, absence of risk, absence of self. For me, safety without purpose felt like burial. On the bus ride back, the driver hummed to the radio, oblivious to the small rebellion forming in my chest. I decided I would not call Sunrise Haven. I would not live behind pastel walls waiting for visiting hours. I had done enough waiting for a lifetime. The next morning, I wrote Claire a letter. I didn't accuse, didn't plead. I simply wrote, "I am fine. I have found a place that suits me. Please stop arranging my life. I have already survived it once. I didn't send it. Not yet." The truth is, I wanted her to wonder, to feel the small ache of uncertainty that she had left me with. Perhaps that was petty, but grief and dignity often share the same spine. Later, as I walked to the market, I noticed how the air smelled different near the sea, cleaner, more insistent. I bought a small bag of apples and a jar of honey, simple things that reminded me of a time when care was given without an invoice. When I returned, Mrs. Green was setting out trays for the morning crowd. She nodded at me, and I asked if she needed help washing up. She looked surprised, then shrugged. "If you want." So I stayed, sleeves rolled to the elbows, rinsing pans under hot water until the steam blurred my glasses. There was comfort in that small labor. Hands know how to remember usefulness long after the world stops asking for it. By closing time, she said, "You're quick. I could use someone like you on mornings." That night, for the first time since leaving Claire's house, I slept without dreaming of doors closing. Days fell into a rhythm. Dawn, bread, coffee, silence. The sea wind crept through the window and carried with it the faintest sound of gulls. I had not felt alive exactly, but I had stopped feeling erased until one afternoon when the phone on the nightstand rang. Unknown number. I answered. Instinct, habit. Her voice, calm, efficient, filled the line. Mom, are you all right? I got a call from the facility. They said you never checked in. The word facility rolled off her tongue like dust. I'm fine, I said. I found somewhere else. A pause, sharp, thin. Where? She demanded. You don't need to worry. Of course I need to worry. You can't just disappear. What if something happens? Something already did. Silence stretched so long I could hear my own breathing. Then she said almost softly, I did my best. I know, I said, though I didn't. She hung up without goodbye. The bakery downstairs smelled of sugar and smoke. I went down and started scrubbing the counters, though it wasn't my shift. Mrs. Green didn't stop me. She just turned the radio louder, as if to give me cover for whatever was breaking inside. There, among the trays and crumbs, I understood something painful and clear. Claire hadn't left because she stopped loving me. She left because she couldn't bear to need me anymore. My existence reminded her of fragility, of the slow decay she refused to face. And in the modern language of self-preservation, that kind of reminder is considered toxic. That night, I stood by the window watching headlights blur along the coastal road. I thought about the word facility. It was precise, efficient, and bloodless, everything I was no longer allowed to be. I thought of my mother, who used to say, when people tell you they're doing what's best for you, they usually mean what's easiest for them. I hadn't understood it then. Now it rang in my ears like scripture. Claire's letter, her calls, her decisions, all of them cloaked in benevolence, had been her escape route, and me, the obstacle she called love. Around midnight, I opened my small suitcase and pulled out the old photograph of Claire at 16, standing beside me at the county fair. We were both laughing, her head tilted toward mine, sunlight catching her hair. I traced the image with my thumb and wondered when exactly she had stopped leaning in. Perhaps love doesn't end with betrayal, but with a gradual turning away, so slow you don't notice, until you're speaking to someone's back. I put the photo back and folded the letter she had sent into the drawer. I would keep it, not as a wound, but as a marker, the point where the map of my life split in two directions, one where I continued shrinking to fit her comfort, and another where I dared to occupy space again. The next morning, I called the phone company to have my number changed. When they asked for a reason, I said, I'm starting fresh. The operator's voice was young, kind. Good for you, she said, probably without thinking. But those 3 words felt like the first benediction I'd heard in years. I walked to work with the wind at my back, the bakery's windows fogged with warmth, and I thought, perhaps this is what freedom sounds like. Not the shout of escape, but the quiet of no one telling you where to go. I didn't fall in a single day. I settled, the way flour settles after a rush of air, drifting down in a quiet that looks like peace to anyone who isn't listening closely. And if there was an escalation, it announced itself not with sirens, but with the small arithmetic of a life that no longer multiplied into family, only divided into hours of work and rooms with doors that opened onto nobody. Morning began before the sun most days because Mrs. Green liked the first trays in by 5, and the window fogged by 5:30. So I learned the bakery's sleeping body the way you learn a lover's breath. The metallic cough of the proofer when it woke, the cluck of the old mixer, the little tremor in the glass when the oven drew its first heat, and I moved inside those sounds like a person trying not to disturb the water she is sinking through. The room upstairs held its shape. Narrow bed, small table, a lamp with a polite buzz, and at the beginning of each week I would smooth the sheet with the flat of my palm as if I were ironing something into order, and at the end of each week the sheet would bear the same diagonal crease where my body turned toward the wall, a fault line I could not mend. I told myself I was getting stronger. My legs remembered the distance between the sink and the front counter. My hands remembered a morning's worth of plates and cups without tremble, and still the quiet was widening, as if the sea outside had come into the walls and drawn back everything that echoed. Money, which had been a conversation my whole adult life, spoken in casseroles for church neighbors, in shoes bought for a child hitting a growth spurt, in payments smoothed with apologies, became a column of figures I wrote in pencil on the back of receipt paper, and I understood that the dignity of work is sometimes just a different winter, one you prepare for by counting instead of praying. Mrs. Green paid on Fridays in a firm envelope that looked almost embarrassed by how light it was. Tips came in a chipped glass that had once held olives, and in the slow hours I discovered the trick of washing a counter even when it is already clean, so that you are always doing something and therefore always allowed to belong. I trimmed my food to fit the days. Eggs on sale, apples when the crates were bruised, tea bags stretched into a second cup by coaxing hot water through the string, like you're asking a favor it might grant if you don't look directly at it. Loneliness is not only a hunger, it is also a tightness around spending, the way you keep your voice low in a museum because the painting is expensive and you feel uninvited in its presence. On Sundays, I walked the promenade after closing, a long elbow of wood over gray water, and watched the gulls invent arguments with the wind. There were couples with dogs and solitary men with headphones and girls in twos and threes practicing the braids of their lives, and I did not exist to them, which was a kind of mercy and a kind of ache that lived side by side and learned not to quarrel. Claire's silence took on a schedule, which is to say, she called when a form required proof of concern, and I came to dread the sound of a voice that could turn, "How are you?" into surveillance. Once she left a voicemail about my pension, and her tone had that lacquer of efficiency that sticks to the skin hours after you wash it off. She said there were fees and automatic transfers, and that she had handled things, a phrase that fluttered in my chest like a trapped moth because I could hear the door sliding shut behind it. I went to the bank on a Tuesday with a scarf over my hair because the wind was overly familiar, and a girl at the counter with nails the color of pickled beets explained my own accounts to me in the gentle tone we reserve for the very young or the finally old. I nodded through the kindness and asked for printed statements, and I carried them in my bag like a small animal that might prove I still existed if someone tried to write me out of the ledger. On the way back, a church bulletin board advertised a grief group that met on Wednesdays. The paper curled at the edges from damp and time, and though I stood there until the cold stepped through the seam of my coat, I did not take a tab with the number, because there is a kind of grief that doesn't want a circle of chairs. It wants a room with a door. You can open and close at will, and rooms cost money, and money is a way of saying yes to yourself that the world does not always allow. The town learned me in that way small towns do when you pass through their habits every day without fanfare. The mailman began leaving my letters on the bakery counter when my upstairs slot stuck in damp weather. The woman at the corner grocer put aside the day-old rye because she noticed I preferred tight crumb and the bread that stood up to butter. The boy who swept the diner next door offered to carry a bag twice, and I told him no because I could, and because generosity directed at the fragile sometimes feels like a mirror tilted toward the face at an angle too tender to bear. At the bakery, regulars began to sort themselves into a chorus of safe distances. The fisherman who ordered 2 black coffees and left coins stacked like a worry stone. The nurse who came off nights with eyes full of something she could not put down. The retired teacher who corrected the chalkboard specials with a grin and then tipped as if paying for her own impertinence. They asked about my day the way people ask about the weather, a question whose answer does not require confession. And still, in the long stretches between orders, I found myself narrating the hours in my head to someone who wasn't there, the way you talk to a child you know is asleep because saying it out loud keeps the story from slipping through your hands. I polished cutlery and learned the local names for wind, and sometimes a smell would arrive, a whiff of Lily's shampoo years ago, the cream-sweet scent of Max's breath when he fell asleep in my lap, and I would grip the counter's edge until the bakery returned to the present and the ghosts resumed their polite positions behind the glass. News travels in towns without using its legs, and sometime in early March, the grocery clerk leaned over the register and said, in the voice of a person who thinks concern is a harmless currency, that she had heard I was moving to a home, which is a word that becomes a knife when you add quotation marks around it. And I realized then that my daughter's version of the story had arrived ahead of me, traveling on wires and casual tongues, the narrative arranged so that duty was the hero, and I was the complicated plot point it had conquered. A week later, 2 women in soft cardigans knocked on the bakery's back door and asked if they might speak with me about wellness, a word that has been padding rooms like a thin carpet for years, and does not cushion as much as it claims. They were from the county, they said, and they had received a call from a concerned family member, and for a long second, the floor of my chest tilted, and I saw myself from above, a woman past the delicate years of being asked what she wants, a body that can be relocated by paperwork. We stood in the alley behind the bakery where the air smelled like yeast and wet cardboard, and I told them I worked mornings, I paid rent, I could show them both if they liked, and one of the women nodded in that rehearsed way and said this was just a check-in, that independence and safety were not enemies, that they were on my side. I believed her, then I didn't. Then I decided belief was not required. I handed over my landlord's number, my schedule, the bank printouts crinkled in my bag, and when they left, I went back inside and washed my hands, as if the soap could remove the part of me that had just been measured. Mrs. Green did not ask what they wanted, which is why I stayed. She only slid a clean towel toward me and said we had a rush coming. I wish I could tell you I faced those weeks with courage. But the truth is more ordinary and therefore heavier. I got good at smallness, at the practice of being where I was without requesting a radius, and every day the world complied by keeping me exactly as it found me. On Saturdays, I took the long route home past the school fields where the goals leaned like old men dozing, and one afternoon I saw a flash of a red coat that looked like the one Lily used to wear, and my feet stopped, and my hands remembered how to tremble, and a girl turned, not Lily, too tall, freckles placed in other constellations, and I felt the jolt of being wrong about something you want very much to be right about. I went home and boiled water and told myself that tea can be a bridge, even when it is only hot water admitting the limits of leaves, and I wrote their names on a scrap of paper and folded it small enough to fit in the seam of my wallet, a private benediction that did not require the postal service to consecrate it. Days kept their shape which is another way of saying they did not notice me. And that is what the first escalation really is. Not the cliff, but the angle, not the cut, but the wearing down. The way a shoreline recedes quietly under a sky that keeps pretending it is innocent. If I was moving toward anything, it was the smallest of hinges inside the chest, a readiness that had not yet found its door. And if you had passed me on the street, you would have thought I was simply a woman carrying bread. But I can tell you now that I was also carrying the weight of not being called by my name, and the weight of that is not a sack you put down. It is the air itself, which you learn to breathe anyway, until one day, you do not yet know which, you open a window and discover the air can move. The first true change didn't arrive with thunder or any gesture that could be mistaken for destiny. It arrived with a letter written in blue ink on a sheet of paper torn from a school notebook, the kind with faint lines and a margin drawn slightly, crooked by a child's uncertain hand. The envelope had been forwarded twice, its corners softened by travel, and for a moment I thought it was another notice or a mistake. But then I saw the small looping handwriting that I would have recognized anywhere. Lily's, my granddaughter's. The return address was their old neighborhood, not the new development Claire had boasted about before everything between us collapsed. And I sat there at the narrow table above the bakery, sunlight pooling on the worn wood, the smell of rising dough, drifting up from below, and read, "Dear Grandma, Mom says you're busy, but I think that means sad. I wanted to write you anyway. Max says hi. We both miss your pancakes. Can I come visit? Love, Lily." There was a drawing at the bottom, a small sketch of a cat sitting in a window. Under it the words, "I hope you have a window too." It was the first time in months that a voice from the family spoke to me without duty or pity, and I sat, very still because I could feel something in my chest rearranging itself, the slow, unfamiliar stirring of hope that had learned to sleep with one eye closed. I kept the letter folded in the pocket of my apron for days, touching it when I reached for a towel or slipped change into a customer's palm, the paper growing soft at the edges like a living thing. I didn't know what to do. To write back was to risk intrusion, to break the quiet safety that had formed like a shell around me. But to ignore it felt like a second betrayal, one committed by the part of me that had begun to resemble my daughter in her careful distance. One evening after closing, Mrs. Green found me staring at the letter again and said, without looking up from the ledger she was balancing, "Whatever it is, answer it. Letters rot faster than bread if you keep them shut." She had no idea what she was advising, or maybe she did. I went upstairs and pulled out a sheet of paper, the kind I used for shopping lists, and began to write. My handwriting had stiffened with disuse. The letters looked like they were leaning on each other for balance. I told Lily that I was safe, that I had a room that smelled like sugar and salt, that I made coffee for sailors and teachers and anyone awake before dawn, and that sometimes, when the gulls circled low, I thought of her laugh. I didn't mention Claire, not directly. I just wrote, "Tell your mother I am finding my way. It's slow work, but I am patient." I sealed the envelope before I could edit myself into caution and mailed it at dawn, slipping it into the box outside the post office where the air smelled of rain and yesterday's tide. 2 weeks later, she appeared. Not in a dream, not as a memory, but as a girl standing in the doorway of the bakery with a backpack slung over one shoulder and uncertainty written across her face. "Grandma," she said, almost whispering, as if afraid to break whatever fragile permission the world had granted her. I was wiping down the counter, my hands still damp, and for a moment I couldn't move. I had imagined this reunion in so many versions, some loud with anger, others trembling with apology, but none prepared me for the simple, trembling reality of her there. The freckles, the nervous bite of her lip, the half-smile that was both her, mother's and mine. Mrs. Green, to her credit, didn't interfere. She handed the girl a cookie the size of her palm and said, "Take your time," then disappeared into the back room. I walked around the counter slowly, feeling the joints in my knees protest, and opened my arms. Lily fit against me like she had been waiting to return to the shape of that embrace. She smelled of rain and school hallways and the faint sweetness of strawberry shampoo. "I told Mom I was meeting a friend," she confessed. "I just wanted to see if you were really okay." I laughed, a soft, broken laugh that felt like something being thawed. "I'm okay enough," I said, which was the truth as best as I could tell it. We sat at the corner table by the window, the one where the morning sun lingered longest, and shared a cup of cocoa. She told me about school, about Max's obsession with building things out of scraps, about her mother's new job that kept her late. She spoke carefully, as if testing whether my name was still allowed in the air. I listened more than I talked. At her age, conversation is trust, not content. When she finally stood to leave, she hesitated at the door. "Can I come again?" she asked. "Only if you bring Max next time," I said, and she grinned, the first unguarded smile of the afternoon. That grin carried me through the week like a secret candle no wind could find. The following Sunday, both children came. Max was taller than I remembered, his voice caught between boy and man, and he was shy at first until the smell of cinnamon rolls broke the awkwardness. We spent the morning baking and talking about nothing consequential, the sea, the strange cats that haunted the alley, the old jukebox in the corner that only played songs older than I was. Their laughter filled the room like a language I hadn't heard spoken in years. They asked to see my apartment, so I led them upstairs. They didn't comment on the smallness or the peeling wallpaper. They just ran to the window and pointed at the gulls. "You do have a window," Lily said, triumphant, and I thought of the drawing on her letter. Before they left, I made them promise to write. Max rolled his eyes in the way boys do when affection embarrasses them, but I saw the warmth under it. For a time, those secret visits became our ritual. Every second Sunday, they appeared, sometimes with muffins, sometimes with nothing but stories. We never spoke of Claire beyond the careful edges of avoidance. It was enough to have this small island of connection where the world's explanations could not reach. Yet the closer they drew, the sharper my awareness of the inevitable storm became. I knew that secrets built on love are still lies, and lies, however gentle, have a habit of finding daylight. I told myself I would be ready when that happened, though I didn't believe it. Still, I could not give up those hours. They were the only ones in which I did not feel like a ghost haunting my own absence. The change inside me grew quietly. I began to laugh again at things that weren't supposed to matter. The way the cash register stuck on threes, the crooked chalk letters on the menu board, the clumsy flirting of the dock workers who came in for coffee. Mrs. Green noticed before I did. "You've got color again," she said one morning while kneading dough. "You seeing someone?" I nearly dropped the tray I was carrying. "Just my grandchildren," I said. She nodded approvingly. "That'll do." I realized then how much life had shrunk around me, how small my expectations had become, and how the slightest kindness could feel like revolution. I started walking after shifts, exploring streets I had ignored, learning the rhythm of the tides, the names of shopkeepers who now greeted me by name. The world was still hard, still indifferent, but I was no longer transparent to it. Then one afternoon, as the children were leaving, Lily turned at the door and said, "Mom says you didn't want us to bother you anymore." The words landed like pebbles on calm water, rippling through every layer of peace I had tried to build. She said you wanted to be left alone, that you needed space, she added quickly, as if defending her mother's story. I looked at her, at the worry already settling behind her eyes, and felt both fury and forgiveness rise at once. People say strange things when they're afraid, I said finally. I never wanted space from you. She nodded, unsure but willing to believe me. When they left, I sat by the window long after dusk, watching their figures shrink down the street until they disappeared. That night, I took out the old phone I had refused to use for months and turned it on. There were messages, voicemails, missed calls, but I didn't listen. I just scrolled through until I saw their names saved there from another lifetime. It comforted me to know they still existed somewhere inside the small glowing screen, unedited by distance. By spring, the visits had become less secret. Mrs. Green knew, the mailman probably guessed, even the woman at the grocer asked once if those sweet kids were mine. I didn't hide it anymore. There was something liberating about letting affection exist in public again, no matter how quietly. I began to think for the first time that I might be allowed a future that didn't revolve around repair, but around presence. I started writing in the evenings, not letters, just notes, snippets of memory, recipes, bits of advice I might never give in person. They were for Lily and Max, though I didn't say their names on the pages. I kept them in a small tin box beside a photo of myself at their age, grinning at the world as if it owed me nothing but sunlight. That girl had been buried under decades of usefulness, but she was breathing again. It was around then that the dreams changed. For months I had dreamt of doors closing, of voices behind them muttering half-words of apology. Now, in sleep, I saw open spaces, roads without destinations, the shimmer of water ahead, the sense that movement itself was enough. That is the strange mercy of love, returned unexpectedly. It doesn't fix what broke. It teaches you to stop needing the pieces to fit exactly as before. And though I knew the reckoning with Claire would come, and that peace built without her acknowledgement could only last so long, I also knew something else just as clearly. The world had tilted back toward possibility, and this time I wasn't. Standing still, the confrontation came on a morning that began like any other, with the smell of yeast thick in the air and the ocean mist pressing faint handprints against the bakery's windows. And yet even before I saw her, I sensed that something in the rhythm of the day had shifted. The bell above the door rang too sharply. The laughter of the early customers sounded brittle, and Mrs. Green's voice, when she asked for more flour, carried that faint tremor people use when they're trying to warn you without saying a word. I turned, and there she was, Claire, my daughter, standing in the doorway like a judgment that had taken human form, dressed in the sleek black coat she wore to funerals and business meetings, her hair perfect, her eyes the same cold blue that used to soften when she was a child, but now gleamed with the careful precision of control. For a moment we simply stared at each other across the room, a tableau of all the distances we had built, until she broke it with a voice that could have sliced through bread without a knife. So this is where you've been hiding. It wasn't the words that struck me. It was the way she said hiding, as though I were a criminal or a wayward teenager. She didn't move closer. She didn't even take off her gloves. You could have told me, she continued, glancing around at the customers, instead of letting the children sneak behind my back. Do you know how irresponsible that is? They're minors, Mother. You don't just pull them into your drama. The room had gone still, the air thickening around us. I wanted to tell her that it was Lily who had reached out first, that I had only answered, that love cannot be trespass when it is returned, but the words were heavy in my throat. Instead, I said quietly. They needed to see me. I needed to see them. It was the truth, small and uncloaked. She laughed, a sound that was more like an exhale of disbelief. Needed? What they need is stability. You don't think, do you? You never did. You just feel, and the rest of us have to clean up after it. The words found their mark because they were old, because they had been rehearsed for decades in smaller, quieter arguments that never got named. I could feel the eyes on us, the half-polite curiosity of strangers who were grateful it wasn't their family on display. Mrs. Green, ever the sentinel, came out from the back with a tray of pastries as though the act of placing something warm on the counter might thaw the air. Claire ignored her. She stepped closer, her voice lower now, but edged with a practiced authority that sounded like professionalism, but smelled faintly of fear. You've been manipulating them, haven't you? Filling their heads with stories about how cruel I am, making them pity you. I should have known. You've always needed an audience for your suffering. It was that line that did it, the calm cruelty of it, because I realized she believed it. She had rewritten the story so completely that she was the victim now, the overburdened daughter, the misunderstood caretaker. I could see it in her eyes, that blend of righteousness and fatigue that people wear when they can no longer tell the difference between love and control. I wanted to shout, to tell her that all I had ever wanted was a place at her table, that I had paid for that table with my own hands once. But shouting would have meant accepting her premise, stepping into her script. Instead, I said, still calm, if pity is all they feel, that's your doing, not mine. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. She took a step back, as if my words had been a physical blow, and for the first time, I saw something fragile flicker behind her anger. Hurt, maybe, or the faint recognition of the woman she used to call Mom without calculation. But she blinked it away, straightened her coat, and said, "You'll be hearing from social services again. You can't keep dragging them into your instability." When she left, the door swung shut so hard, the bell clattered against the glass, and the sound seemed to echo for hours. I stood there among the trays and the flour dust, my hands trembling, but not from fear. It was something deeper, a mix of grief and clarity that felt almost like relief. Mrs. Green didn't say anything. She poured me a cup of coffee and slid it across the counter, and we stood there, two women in the wreckage of another woman's pride, breathing through the aftermath. "You should sit down," she said at last. "No," I replied. "I think I'll finish the bread." And I did, because there's a kind of sanity that comes from refusing to let someone else define when your day is over. That afternoon, a man in a Navy windbreaker arrived asking for me. He introduced himself as a caseworker, just checking in, and I almost laughed. Claire wasted no time. He was young, polite, uncomfortable with the role he had been sent to play. He asked if I felt safe, if I had any financial difficulties, if anyone was taking advantage of me. His questions were written on a clipboard that smelled of bureaucracy and guilt. I answered them with the patience of someone who has already been accused and absolved 100 times in silence. When he left, he shook my hand and said, "You seem fine." I wanted to tell him that seeming fine is a survival skill learned by women who've spent their lives being told they're too much, but I let him keep his illusion. He'd need it to sleep that night. Later that week, Lily and Max came again, their faces pale with the kind of guilt children should never have to carry. "Mom found out," Lily whispered before I could even greet them. "She said we can't see you anymore." Max's fists were clenched in his pockets, his jaw set in that stubborn angle that was all his grandfather's. I knelt so I could look them both in the eyes. "Listen to me. I said softly. None of this is your fault. Sometimes adults get scared and confuse that with being right. But fear is not love, no matter what name it wears. Lily nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks, while Max looked away, trying to be older than he was. We sat like that for a while, the three of us, in the quiet hum of the bakery where the smell of sugar tried its best to disguise sorrow. Before they left, I pressed a small notebook into Lily's hand. If you can't come, write. Words can travel where people can't. She promised she would, though her eyes said she didn't believe she'd be allowed. When the door closed behind them, the emptiness that followed was heavier than any loneliness I had known before, because this one carried the outline of laughter that had just been here. The next morning I woke to find an envelope slipped under my door. It was from Claire, handwritten this time. The first line read, "If you ever loved me, stop involving the children." I sat on the bed, the early light turning the paper translucent, and thought about that sentence, "If you ever loved me." How easily she used the past tense, how naturally she assumed love could be revoked like a license. I wanted to write back that love doesn't end, it only changes shape, that sometimes it has to become distance to survive. But instead I placed the letter in the drawer beside Lily's first one and closed it. There would be a time to answer, but not yet. Days turned into weeks, and for a while I thought that was the end of it. The visits stopped, of course, though occasionally I would see Lily across the street after school, her eyes flicking toward the bakery like a guilty prayer. I never waved. I couldn't risk making her world harder than it already was. Yet the quiet that settled around me was not the same as before. It had texture now, a kind of charged stillness that suggested change was approaching, even if I didn't yet know from which direction. And then one morning, the mail brought a letter, not from Claire or the children, but from a lawyer. It was about my late husband's pension, about some irregularities in the distribution. Apparently, certain transfers had been made to an account that was not mine. The words were formal, but their meaning was plain. Claire had been using my funds for years. Not out of malice, perhaps, but convenience, the same justification she'd always used for everything she took in the name of order. For a long time I simply stared at the letter, the air thick with disbelief. Then something unexpected happened. I didn't feel rage. I felt calm, a terrible, almost luxurious calm. It was as if the universe had finally laid out the full map of betrayal, no longer blurred by love's excuses. I took the day off, walked by the sea, until my knees ached, and thought about all the versions of myself that had obeyed in the name of harmony. When I returned, I called the number at the bottom of the page. The lawyer, a woman with a voice like gravel and patience, explained the process. It would take time, but yes, I could reclaim what was mine. She asked if I had someone to support me through it. Yes, I said. Myself. That decision changed everything, though quietly at first. I began keeping a journal of every expense, every hour worked, every bill paid, as if rebuilding the ledger of my own worth. Mrs. Green noticed me staying later after shifts, going over papers at the counter. Starting a business? She teased. No, I said, smiling faintly, just learning to stop being invisible. I mailed documents, answered calls, met with officials who looked at me with the polite skepticism reserved for women of a certain age, who suddenly start using words like legal representation. Each signature I made felt like a stitch closing an old wound. There were days of doubt, of course, mornings when I'd wake with the urge to call Claire and offer peace before war even began. But then I would remember the sound of her voice that day in the bakery, the cold certainty with which she had accused me, and I would pour that memory into resolve. The news reached her sooner than I expected. One evening my phone rang, an unfamiliar number, and when I answered, her voice came through, strained, brittle. "What are you doing?" she demanded, no greeting. "They told me about the claim. Are you trying to ruin me? You know how this makes me look?" I closed my eyes, took a breath, and said, "It's not about you, Claire. It's about what's rightfully mine." There was a pause, and then she said something I will never forget. "You can't do this to me. I'm your daughter." I almost laughed, not cruelly, but in wonder at the inversion of it all. "Exactly," I replied. "You're my daughter, and I've spent too long letting that title excuse everything. This time it doesn't." She hung up without another word. The silence afterward was so deep it seemed to alter the shape of the room. In the weeks that followed, the bakery became my sanctuary and my battlefield. The regulars noticed a difference, something in my posture maybe, the way I spoke with a steadier rhythm. Even Mrs. Green commented that I looked taller. I wasn't, of course, but perhaps my spine had remembered it once knew how to hold its own weight. The nights were long. Legal processes moved slower than grief, and there were moments when I doubted whether justice mattered at all in the arithmetic of family. But each letter I received, each confirmation of progress, was another small affirmation that I was not the ghost of someone's mother, but a woman still capable of shaping her own narrative. When the final papers arrived, declaring the funds restored to my account, I made no grand gesture. I simply went to the bank, withdrew a modest amount in cash, and paid Mrs. Green 2 months' rent in advance. "Planning a trip?" she asked. "No," I said, smiling. "Planning a beginning." It was then, I think, that Claire understood something she could neither forgive nor undo, that I no longer needed her permission to exist. She didn't call again. Perhaps she thought silence would punish me, or perhaps it was the only language she had left. But her absence no longer felt like exile. It felt like room. I filled that room slowly, with work, with letters from Lily written in secret, with small luxuries like a better lamp and the scent of fresh lavender by my bed. And though the wound of that confrontation still ached on certain days, I found that when I stood at the window watching the sea, I could breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs. For the first time in years, the air belonged to me. It happened quietly, almost ceremonially, as if life had decided to disguise revolution in the clothing of an ordinary day. The letter from the court arrived on a Thursday morning, folded and official, the kind of paper that carries more weight than its ounces suggest. I held it in my hands for a long time before opening it, feeling the faint tremor in my fingers that comes not from weakness, but from the recognition that something long endured is about to shift its form. The bakery was still asleep. Mrs. Green had gone to the market, and the smell of yesterday's bread lingered faintly in the air. I sat at the counter, the morning light cutting the room into halves, and unfolded the document. The words were simple. The pension funds had been legally restored, the account transferred, the matter closed. There was no apology, no poetry, just a paragraph of bureaucratic finality. Yet to me, it felt like a benediction. For the first time in years, something that belonged to me had been returned without negotiation, without guilt, without someone reminding me that gratitude was the price of my own survival. I let out a long, slow breath and realized that the space around me felt larger, as if the walls themselves had taken a step back to make room for the woman I was becoming. The act that followed was both practical and sacred. I went to the bank, wearing the dark blue coat I had saved from better times, the one Claire used to call too formal for errands. I waited in line behind a man arguing over an overdraft fee, behind a mother soothing a restless toddler, behind the small, ordinary crises that fill a morning in any town. When my turn came, I withdrew enough to settle my debts, enough to breathe. The teller, a young man with the uncertain politeness of someone new to the job, asked if I wanted the bills in larger denominations. I shook my head. "Smaller ones, please," I said. He nodded, unaware that in that simple preference lay a declaration. I would not let my independence exist only in abstraction. I wanted to hold it, count it, use it, let it pass through my hands like proof. I placed the envelope in my bag and walked out into the sunlight, feeling the weight of the money not as currency, but as evidence that the narrative had changed. On my way back, I stopped at a small apartment building 2 streets over, the one with the faded "for rent" sign I had been eyeing for weeks. The landlord, a widower named Alvarez, showed me a space on the 2nd floor overlooking the ocean. It wasn't grand, 2 rooms, a balcony, paint peeling at the edges, but when I stepped inside, the sound of the sea entered with me like an old friend. The windows opened without resistance. The floorboards creaked in a tone that felt more alive than worn, and in that moment, I knew this was where the story had to turn. I signed the lease on the spot. It wasn't defiance, it was reclamation. I would no longer live above someone else's work, breathing the air of their decisions. I would have my own key, my own light, my own silence that answered to no one. Moving was easy because I owned so little. A few clothes, some dishes, the photograph of Claire at 16, the letters from Lily and Max, and the tin box filled with notes I had written to the children when they couldn't come. Mrs. Green helped me carry the boxes, grumbling affectionately, insisting that I keep the kettle from the bakery in case you ever miss my tea. When we finished, she hugged me, awkwardly but firmly. "You were good company," she said. "Try not to vanish." I promised I wouldn't. The bakery door closed behind me for the last time that evening, and I stood in the street for a while, listening to the muffled sound of the mixer inside, feeling both grateful and unanchored. Freedom, I was learning, comes with a strange vertigo. The first night in the new apartment, I left the windows open and let the salt air wash over everything. I made a simple dinner, poured a glass of wine I couldn't really afford, and sat by the window, watching the horizon fade from silver to black. The sea has a way of speaking without words, of reminding you that permanence is an illusion, but continuation is a choice. I thought of my husband, of the years we spent building a life that had been sold off piece by piece, of the promise we once made to leave something solid for our daughter. I wondered what he would think of this version of me, older, lonelier, but finally unafraid. I think he would have smiled that quiet smile he had when I surprised him with strength. It was close to midnight when I decided to write the letter, not the kind that asks or explains, but the kind that ends a story. I took out a clean sheet of paper, the last one in the stack, and began slowly, deliberately. You can stop worrying about me. I'm finally living as if I mattered. I paused, listening to the rhythm of the sentence, feeling the honesty of it settle in the room. I didn't add accusations, didn't revisit the catalog of wounds. There was no need. The power of truth lies in its simplicity. I signed it Mom, folded it neatly, and slipped it into an envelope without an address. I would send it the next morning. Or maybe I wouldn't. Maybe its purpose was only to be written, to exist as testimony that I had survived the erasure. That night I dreamt of water, not drowning, but floating. The current carried me toward a horizon that shimmered like possibility, and I remember thinking, even in sleep, that I was no longer afraid of where it might take me. When I woke, the room was filled with early light, soft and unhurried. I boiled water for coffee, opened the balcony doors, and watched the world begin again. Down on the street, Children were walking to school, their backpacks bouncing, their laughter uncontained. I recognized Lily's red coat among them. She was walking quickly, glancing around as if she half expected to see me. When she did, her face lit up, that same unguarded joy I had seen the first day she stepped into the bakery. She waved, a small movement, uncertain but brave. I waved back just once, and though we didn't speak, that moment carried enough meaning to fill all the unsent letters in the world. Later that day, I took the letter I had written to Claire and posted it. The mailbox swallowed it with a sound like closure. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't need one. Some acts exist only to restore balance within the self, not to change the other. I spent the rest of the morning unpacking, placing the photo of Claire and me on the shelf, arranging the dishes, lighting the candle I had kept since my husband's funeral. Every object found its place. Every breath felt earned. In the afternoon, I walked to the pier where the fishermen mended their nets and bought a small bundle of wildflowers from a boy with a bicycle. I placed them on my balcony later, and as the wind moved through them, scattering petals into the sea, I thought of all the years I had given away to silence and obligation, and how, in the end, it was not vengeance, but tenderness that had brought me back to myself. Toward evening, the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number again, and for a moment I hesitated, expecting another bureaucrat or perhaps another storm from Claire. But when I answered, it was Lily. Her voice was shaking, both from excitement and fear. "Grandma," she said, "Mom told us we could visit if we wanted. She said you have your own place now." I closed my eyes, letting the words settle. There was no triumph in them, only the quiet recognition that something had shifted on her side too, perhaps not forgiveness, but the first step toward it. "Of course you can," I said. "The door is open." And I meant it, both literally and in every sense that matters. When they arrived that weekend, the apartment came alive in a way I hadn't realized it was missing. Max went straight to the balcony, fascinated by the view. Lily explored the kitchen, inspecting my mismatched plates and the new kettle. "It smells like you," she said, and I laughed. We cooked together, clumsily but joyfully, filling the rooms with the sound of pans and stories. At one point, Lily looked at me and asked, "Are you happy now?" The question was so honest, it stilled me. I thought about all the definitions of happiness I had tried on in my life: obedience, usefulness, approval, and how none had ever fit quite right. "I think I'm learning how," I said finally. "That's a start, isn't it?" She nodded, satisfied, and went back to stirring the sauce. That evening, after they had left, I sat again by the window, the same place where months ago I had stared into the hollow of absence. The difference was almost imperceptible, yet enormous. Now, when I looked at the sea, I saw not what it had taken, but what it still offered. I realized that reclaiming my pension, my home, my dignity, those were not acts of rebellion against my daughter, but acts of allegiance to the woman I had always been beneath her shadow. It wasn't about winning. It was about returning to the simple truth that I still existed beyond her definitions. The legal documents, the new apartment, even the money, they were just symbols. The real victory was quieter, found in the steady rhythm of my own breathing, in the knowledge that I had walked through the fire of abandonment and come out not unscarred, but unburned. When the light faded, I lit the candle again, the one from my husband's wake, and placed it on the windowsill. The flame bent slightly in the wind, but didn't go out. I watched it until the wax pooled around its base, and for the first time in many years, I whispered aloud, not a prayer, not a wish, but a simple acknowledgement. I made it. The words felt solid, like stepping onto firm ground after too long at sea. Outside, the tide was rising, the air thick with salt and renewal, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised even me, that life, for all its cruelty, still knows how to give back when you finally learn to claim what was yours all along. The days that followed unfolded with a kind of gentleness I had almost forgotten life could allow, as if the world, having watched me stumble for so long, had finally decided to give me the mercy of ordinary peace. The apartment settled around me like a second skin. The scent of sea salt clung to the curtains. The floor creaked in familiar tones, and the light that poured through the balcony every morning seemed to arrive not from the sun, but from something deeper, a patience that had been waiting all along for me to come home to myself. There were no grand events, no last-minute reconciliations or cinematic embraces, only the slow rhythm of mornings that began with the whistle of my kettle and the soft hiss of the sea beyond the window. Sometimes the children came, sometimes they didn't, but the space between their visits no longer felt like an ache. It felt like room, space for breath, for thought, for quiet wonder at having survived. On one of those mornings, as I arranged a vase of lilies, my namesake flower, bought from the same boy on the pier, I found myself thinking about Claire, not with anger, but with an unfamiliar tenderness. She had not called again, but I had heard from Lily that she seemed less tired lately, which I understood as the language children use when they mean their mother cries less often. Perhaps she had found her own kind of peace, or perhaps she was learning to live without the constant need to rewrite our story. I no longer needed her apology. Forgiveness, I had learned, is not a gift you give to someone who wronged you. It is a room you build inside yourself where their shadow no longer reaches. In that room, I could think of her not as the woman who abandoned me, but as the frightened child I once cradled, the one who used to wake from nightmares and reach for my hand. That memory, once painful, had softened. I could finally let it stay. Every Sunday, the grandchildren visited, and the apartment became a place of laughter and noise. Max discovered the old radio on the shelf and spent hours turning the dial until he found a station that played music older than all of us, and he would dance awkwardly in the living room while Lily sat by the window sketching the sea. We never talked about the months of silence or the quarrels between their mother and me. They didn't need to hear that story again. Instead, we made new ones. We baked bread that never rose quite evenly, and Lily painted the cracked flower pots on the balcony with bright colors that looked almost defiant against the white walls. Once, when I caught her studying me while she drew, I asked what she was doing. "I'm trying to get your hands right," she said. "They look strong, but they're gentle too." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just smiled and kept slicing apples for the tart. Strength and gentleness had never lived easily together in me before. Perhaps it had taken all these years for them to stop fighting. There were still moments, of course, when loneliness drifted in like fog, quiet, heavy, unavoidable. On those nights I would sit by the window with my cup of tea and watch the distant lights of fishing boats, thinking of all the women out there who, like me, had given the best of themselves to others until they became invisible, and who now were learning, painfully and beautifully, to be visible again. I imagined them waking before dawn, tying their scarves, opening windows, beginning again without witness or applause. I wanted to tell them that survival is not a story of victory. It is a story of persistence, of the small daily rebellions that say, "I am still here, and I will not disappear quietly." One evening, when the sky was the color of pewter and the air smelled of coming rain, Lily handed me a folded piece of paper before they left. "You forgot to check my sketchbook," she said, pretending it was nothing, and ran downstairs after her brother. I unfolded it later, after the apartment had fallen silent. It was a drawing of the three of us, me in the middle, the children on either side, standing on the balcony surrounded by flowers. In the corner she had written in her uneven hand, "Our home is warm again." I felt something unclench inside me, a knot I hadn't realized I was still carrying. But when I turned the page over, there was another line written in a different hand, one I recognized instantly. The letters were smaller, neater, and trembled slightly. "Thank you for loving them when I couldn't." It was Claire's writing. I sat very still, the paper trembling in my lap, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry, not from hurt, but from release. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was enough. It was a bridge, fragile and human, stretching across everything that had broken between us. The next morning, I pinned the drawing to the wall above my desk. The edges curled slightly from the humidity, but I didn't mind. It looked alive, as if breathing. Beneath it, I placed a small note of my own, written in the same blue ink Lily had used in her first letter to me. "Love does not die when it is refused. It waits, patient and stubborn, until someone remembers how to open the door." Every day when I passed that corner, I would read those words aloud, a quiet reminder that the past is not a chain, but a soil from which new tenderness can grow if you stop trying to dig it up and start tending to what has survived. As months passed, I began teaching a few of the neighborhood children how to bake, a simple thing that made them laugh and left their hands covered in flour. Word spread, and soon, Mrs. Green sent her niece to learn, and then another neighbor brought her grandson. The little apartment filled with the scent of yeast and stories, and I realized that in teaching them, I had found a new way of belonging. They called me abuela, even the ones who weren't mine, and sometimes I caught myself humming as I worked, the same melody my mother had sung when I was a girl. It felt like the circle of women behind me, my mother, her mother, all those before, had finally steadied the ground under my feet. One late afternoon, as the children left, and the last light of day stretched long across the kitchen floor, I brewed a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the balcony. The sea was calm, its surface turning gold beneath the sun, and the horizon seemed closer than usual, as if the world itself were leaning in to listen. I thought about everything that had led me here, the years of silence, the humiliation, the distance, the slow, deliberate work of reclaiming myself. And for once, I didn't wish any of it away. Pain, I realized, is not something you escape. It's something you weave into the fabric of what comes next, a darker thread that makes the lighter ones shine more honestly. I lifted the cup, as if in a toast to no one and to everyone, and whispered, "For all of us who made it this far." When night came, I sat at my small desk and began to write another letter, not to Claire or the children, but to whoever might find it. Someday, a woman perhaps sitting alone, doubting that her life could still change. "If you are reading this," I wrote, "know that love can return in forms you don't expect. Sometimes it wears the face of a child, sometimes the silence of forgiveness, sometimes the taste of your own cooking after years of feeding others first. Don't wait for permission to live. Begin quietly, in your own kitchen, with your own hands. That is where dignity is reborn." I didn't sign it. It didn't need a name. I left the letter tucked beneath the drawing on the wall and turned off the lamp. The room glowed softly from the streetlights outside, and the sound of waves rose and fell like breathing. As I lay down, I felt the small pulse of contentment that comes not from having everything, but from having enough. Enough peace, enough time, enough of myself to meet tomorrow without fear. And just before sleep took me, I thought of Lily's words. Our home is warm again, and smiled, because they were true in every sense that mattered. The warmth wasn't just in the walls or the air. It was in me. Finally, after a lifetime of waiting to be welcomed back into my own heart.